So with the Dusk Till Dawn spoilers, United We Stand, we have this very important new bit of text, right? So when this defends together with cards from hand, if Bolton is in your party, create a courage token. Then repeat for Bravo, as in Bravo in your party, Briar in your party, Lexi in your party, etc. Right? So this party mechanic is at the forefront of a lot of people's thinking, especially when it comes to something in the case of PVE. So that is what I want to sort of throw my hat in the ring, I guess, and go over what I would potentially like to see when it comes to PVE, given the fact that, again, we do have the party mechanic, we have the transition from the normal sideboard terminology to this new inventory mechanic that we've seen utilized by Arachne and recycling daggers, or utilized by Assassin and Ninja, I should say. And in this regards, there is also another video up on Riddlerman's channel where we sat down and had a discussion about my reflection of FaB 2.0, but we also did touch on PVE. So if you want to listen to that side of things, go check it out. Otherwise, I have mocked up some basic cards, right, to sort of explain my perspective and what I would like to see. So we have a blank one right here. So first, allow me to elaborate on the core mechanics that I think could make bosses function in Flesh and Blood, right? Because my idea for PvE mostly isn't sort of like campaigns or, you know, conquering dungeons, adding a whole plethora of cards to support PvE. I think it should sort of be streamlined similar to the mechanics of PvP, just with a different face card, if you will, or a card that you have to verse or fight and conquer. Okay, so my core concept is just a singular boss that you're going to play against, right? So a sort of auto-functioning deck. And in line with that, the main elements that I think would make this mechanic work are the following. Okay, so starting off with life. Okay, X. What I would personally like to see is it again to play off this new party mechanic. So life would be whatever it is, call it 10, 20, 30, multiplied by the total number of party members in the, well, from the boss's perspective, opponents. Okay, so if there are 3 of you taking on this boss and say its life is 20, then you multiply that by 3. So its starting life would be 60. The other big aspect is the intellect stat. Okay, so this as well needs to play a vital role. I think, generally speaking, you keep the template very similar to that of the current heroes, right? Because then you also have the ability to sort of allow the cards to cross over into the PvP territory. I'm not necessarily saying, you know, make bosses playable by players in a PvP setting and then make their decks auto-function in a PvE setting, but just keeping the same core mechanics of Flesh and Blood, but make a PvE variant, right? Because that way, it's not like we have 2 games stapled together, right? So people who want to play PvE are going to go after the PvE sets. People who want to play PvP are going to go after the standard sets. We need some sort of middle ground between both PvP and PvE, in my personal perspective, to make it work within the community, work within the set design, and work within the products produced by Legend Story Studios in terms of Flesh and Blood. Having 2 diverse games within a game isn't going to function well. Okay, so the life mechanic, again, just multiply it by the amount of participants in the party. The intellect stat, have it serve as the boss's main sort of playable mechanic, right? So what do I mean by that? So say the intellect is 2. The boss will have some sort of core mechanic that allows it to draw cards equal to the intellect stat from its boss deck, and then play those cards, right? So if it's 2, it will reveal 2 cards from the top of its boss deck and play them against the opponents. Speaking of which, how do we go about sort of targeting where the cards are resolved? So I think that there should be a core mechanic where a player does X, and that causes the boss to rotate and consider them the targeted player, right? This allows for people in your party to then manipulate the boss so that it targets certain players within the party, players who might, you know, have a more defensive deck, and allow them to block and absorb the boss's attacks or turns a bit more effectively than other party members who might have decks more suitable for aggression. And then a flavorful thing that I would like to see is all the boss cards be double-sided. And essentially, if you were to beat the boss's life to half its starting life, it would flip over and it would enrage, right? The mechanics would change. Its intellect might be increased. So in other words, the amount of cards it's playing on its turn would be increased. The mechanic for which it designates the targeted player, so call it, say, you pitch red on this first phase. Okay, it targets the first player to pitch red every turn. Then on the flip side, it might now target people who pitch blue. right? So you have to play around this mechanic, and your deck construction to actually verse the boss needs some sort of thought, right? Because you're going to transition from the player who's mainly pitching red, has somewhat of a quicker deck, to then the player who's now pitching blue and has somewhat of a slower or high cost deck. That's it. Enough staring at the blank template. I've come up with some mock cards, so why don't we actually look at some proper examples? Just use some helpful images of my cat. I've just tried to get this done somewhat quickly, so there might be typos, there might be a little bit of errors, and the art itself is just some nice filtered photos, if you will. Okay, so we have the Watchful Sentinel. Starting life is multiplied by the number of party members present. Okay, so in this case, it's 30 on the card, but if you are bringing 2 people to the encounter, right, it'd be 60, 3 people 90, 4 people 120, and so on. Then, whenever a player pitches a red card, rotate the boss to face them. They are now considered the targeted player. So this is the core mechanic of designating or allowing the boss to function autonomously. Okay, so it designates a targeted player to resolve all of its cards against. After a player finishes drawing all cards as a result of an effect or phase, reveal cards equal to the boss's intellect from their deck and resolve all effects against the targeted player. Okay, so we have our way to control aggro, and then we have the actual encounter mechanic that we now have to play against, right? So every time a player finishes their turn or uses any card to draw cards, they now have to deal with the boss attacking them. Okay, so on your turn, you might want to be careful what cards you pitch, right? You avoid pitching red because you don't want the boss to now target you. But at the same time, if you draw cards, right, your end phase or any cards within your deck that are used to draw cards, you're going to cause the boss to react against the player it has targeted, right? So everyone has to be somewhat considerate of what they're doing on their turn. Then if this card is below half its starting life during a player's end phase, flip it over. Real cards from the treasure pool equal to twice the total party members. This is another key concept that I think would allow it to tie in a bit better to the ongoing state of Flesh and Blood, because personally I do think the sort of ways to increase the game without power creeping would be to allow players to transition to more inventory use. So rather than just say flick knives allowing us to cycle through daggers, if more heroes had access to the inventory and be able to equip certain cards again and again and again, right, it would draw out Classic Construct, it would draw out Blitz, it would allow the games to use more quick active equipment over high value equipment, right, because then you could cycle back into better equipment. I think that would be a great mechanic for the bosses in themselves. So what I am proposing is, again, you beat the first phase of the boss and you're rewarded with a few treasure cards, be it equipment, be it maybe cards to add to your deck or something in that vein, that you can then take and divide between the party so that you can restock just before you start the next phase of the boss, which is the flip side. So we have Leo, the regal feline, looking very majestic, right? So life is X, life will just be whatever it was on the previous side, right? So it says below half its starting life. So if you got it to 15, right, the health would be 15. If you got it lower than 15 before it flips, then it'll be lower than 15. So we start off with create 3 Feline Grace tokens. Then whenever a player creates a token, rotate this card to face them. They are now considered the targeted player. So we've transitioned away from the pitch mechanic to another mechanic that you now have to play around. And it's a bit harder to control where the boss is going to attack and to actually transition between aggro and therefore soak up the damage that the boss is going to dish out. I think this is what will really create the dynamicism of the event, is you will need specific deck types, right? Different players will have to run specific things in their deck so that they can play around this core mechanic of targeting a player. And then we have, again, after a player finishes drawing all cards as a result of an effect or phase, reveal and play cards equal to the boss's intellect, which is now 3, against the targeted player. If no cards can be revealed, deal 3 unpreventable damage to the targeted player. So essentially, if you just treat it as a war of attrition, right, and you get the boss to exhaust all of the cards in its deck, then it's just going to flail about and deal 3 damage every time it would go to attack. Okay, so it's both a severe effect, right, because 3 damage being unpreventable is going to amount, but at the same time you don't have to deal with specific attack action cards or defense action cards or whatever cards we actually supply the boss with. Then we have, whenever the boss deals damage to a player, reveal and play another card from their deck. Resolve all effects against the target player. So we have a harsher effect or an enraged effect, if you will, right? So it's really important that in this second phase, you are preventing damage, because the boss is just going to continue to cycle through cards and then eventually reach this 3 unpreventable damage effect. Meaning that, you know, it's a bit of a time crunch, like the enrage mechanic in the majority of bosses when it comes to a RPG, right? An RPG game. So I think that's the core concept. Again, these 4 mechanics: a way to control aggro, a way to play cards autonomously, the starting life scaling to the amount of people participating, and then these 2 mechanics, a sort of treasure round or a way to recoup and replenish as the players, and then a enrage effect on the harsher side of the boss. Okay, so that's the boss, but what about cards? Because I thought I might as well extend it past, right? Have a bit of fun, see if I can come up with some creative things. So we've got these feline grace tokens, and I think this is going to be the core concept of this boss, quote unquote, but is still a good example for other bosses going forward, right? Because the majority of heroes have a token system or some sort of extra system that makes them unique and allows them to do extra things. So for instance, we have like Blood Rod, Inertia, we have Spectral Shields, we'll now have Figments, we have Ash, Seismic Surge, all that good stuff. So why not just tack it onto a boss as well? So we've got Feline Grace. So it's an aura stays in the arena until they are destroyed. The next time you're dealt damage, instead destroy Feline Grace. Prevent all damage, end the combat chain, and reveal 1 card from the top of your deck. You may play it this turn. If this card is revealed on behalf of a boss, resolve it against the targeted player. So I think that's fairly well balanced, right? So essentially it's just a soak. It prevents damage, ends the combat, and allows you to play 1 extra card. And then it has this extra tag. So again, if it's played on behalf of a boss, in which case this is what the hero is, right? It's the boss hero. It's going to resolve it against the target player, continuing with the autonomous nature of the boss deck. Because again, I want it to run autonomous. I want to essentially be like if you ever saw the Warcraft TCG, right? They had boss encounters. They had like Onyxia. That was the main one I played. I'm guessing they had more too. And they function autonomously, right? You just reveal cards and then you have to deal with the effects. Then in terms of actual attack actions, we have Cat Burglar. So banish a random card from your opponent. You may play it this turn. If the banished, that's typo. So if the card banished, if a card is banished on behalf of a boss, resolve it against the target player. There, we got there in the end. Right, so again, mechanics play around, again, this transition or this idea that if it's played within a boss encounter, it's autonomous, but at the same time, I want to keep the cards open because there's another big thing that I want to factor into PvE. And again, it comes back to this middle ground between PvP and PvE. There has to be some commonality between the cards. There has to be some usefulness between the cards for it to really function well in terms of markability, in terms of marketing, right? So if you were to have the boss cards, right, the cards that make up the boss deck, be playable by some sort of hero. The main idea that I'm floating is a shapeshifter hero. So a shapeshifter hero that, rather than using the specializations of different classes, it uses the boss cards of bosses, right? So you could have a shapeshifter and they could have access to all of the feline cards. So the cards that make up the PvE encounter are now actually viable in PvP. Okay, so the cards still have value. This would mean that obviously balancing needs to be tweaked, but I think the good common ground is to have just this end statement that allows it to function slightly different, but not completely, when it comes to being played on behalf of a boss encounter. Then we also have a boss-specific mechanic, so Catnap. If Cat Burglar deals no damage, gain 2 life, right? So if you fully block it, the boss is going to heal. So it allows you to, again, think about trade-offs, and then also think about the tanking mechanic, right? Because the boss is going to rotate between players depending on who actually triggers the mechanic. So you can then either, fully defend, heal the boss up, prolong the encounter, take a little bit of damage, and then allow another player to come in and change aggro. Then we have Foot to the Face. If Foot to the Face hits, create a Feline Grace token and reveal 1 card from the top of your deck and gain Go Again. You may play it this turn. If the card is revealed on behalf of a boss, resolve it against the target player. So again, it has that autonomous mechanic if it's played on behalf of the boss, but then could still be viable in a class that could make use of the boss-specific cards. It also plays off of Catnap, right? So Catnap is if you prevent all the damage, but in this case, if you don't prevent the damage, it's going to create the Feline Grace token and then also allow the player or the boss to play an extra card. Lays About. For every opponent, return the top card of your graveyard to the bottom of your deck. Catnap again, so if Lays About deals no damage, gain 2 life. Essentially, Catnap is just, if it's fully blocked, you gain life equal to the amount of damage it would have dealt. But this is an interesting one to talk about. So for every opponent, return the top card of your graveyard to the bottom of your deck. This is sort of a mechanic I'm thinking about when it comes to bosses, right? Because I think a big aspect of Flesh and Blood is the end fight, right? Once you've exhausted your cards, once your opponent's exhausted your cards, once all the equipment's gone, and you're just there slugging it out with whatever you can. You're keeping a card to pitch so that you can reuse your weapons, and you're just struggling. And I think that is a good thing to carry over in terms of the bosses, right? So having cards cycling back, yes, can prolong the counter, because I haven't actually touched on how many cards would occupy a boss deck, right? Because that's another thing to consider, to think about. And I don't have an answer, right? If there's 8 people participating in the boss fight, what do you multiply the amount of cards available in the deck by 80? Do you keep it to 60 and then the boss just runs out of cards quicker? Is there some mechanic to cycle back? So between this effect or cards with this type of effect that allow the boss to cycle cards back, and then this end game effect, right? So the boss's struggle is just to cause 3 unpreventable damage. Rather than utilize a weapon or anything like that, I just wanted to have a flat mechanic that comes into effect when the boss is quote-unquote struggling. So that is another thing to think about and I haven't fully fleshed out. I do want to do more videos on this, probably after we see all the cards from Dusk Till Dawn and get a better perspective on the direction it might seem like Legend Story Studios is heading. I will continue. I'd also like to actually do proper art. It's been a while since I've gone back into drawing, and this is a good excuse to. Next card, Nowhere to Hide, right? X is equal to the total number of players in the opponent's party. If this card will deal damage, instead deal that damage against the player with the lowest life. Then again, Catnap. So if it deals no damage, gain X life. The damage on this card is that X mechanic. Then we have Savage Assault. Create a Blood Rot Pox token under each opponent's control. Catnap. So this is a heavy hitting card, right? If you block it, you won't have to suffer the damage, you won't have to suffer the Blood Rot Pox, but at the same time, the boss is going to recover greatly from it. And then lastly, Vicious Struggle. If Vicious Struggle hits, duplicate all damage against that player until the end of the next turn. This is another cool mechanic that I think works in the PvE setting, right? Because if you have this huge party, and we target a player who's not going to go for several turns, then this effect is super strong, right? Because it means that they're going to take a bunch of damage. Because every turn they're going to be targeted and targeted and targeted until they get their turn again. And if there's 8 of you in a party, they might not have another turn for 7 rounds. And that's huge. Plus, if they're already holding aggro, it's less incentive to change aggro. So I think mechanics sort of like this that scale with the amount of players present is another thing that needs to be heavily considered when it comes to PvE. But in the same sense, to have it valuable, or I guess reduced to a reasonable state, if it were to be played in a PvP setting. Because again, if the cards are accessible across the spectrum, right, both in PvE and PvP, then they can be marketed in any single set, which is fabulous. And again, you need mechanics that function well in both. So in this case, if the party participating in the encounter is large, it's going to add up to a high amount of damage. But if it's just one-on-one, well, it's only probably going to last for 1 turn, because we haven't seen anything yet that allows you to go again straight away or completely skip your opponent's turn. Altogether, these are some of the core ideas that I've thought up when it comes to PvE and what I personally would like to see. I am on the side of boss encounters rather than campaigns or these big large encounters. I think just having a autonomous opponent is a decent idea. It makes it a lot more feasible. Time-wise, it's a lot more maintainable. If you have a larger party, that's going to take longer. If you have a smaller party, it's going to be a lot quicker. Rather than campaigns that, if we think of it in, say, a D&D setting, might go on for hours, which in a casual sense, right, in a you play with your friends, is perfect. In a LGS setting, right, not going to work. You can't have events that run several hours, right? You could have pause to start, but then that loses some of its luster. So I think having a encounter like this is going to be the stronger marketable aspect for Legend Story Studios. And there are, again, a lot of ways to tie it in to PvP, which I'll probably elaborate on in the future. I've got some drawing to do. Plus, again, I want to see what Dusk Till Dawn really has to, further cement the ideas that I've been working on. Anyway, hope you enjoyed. Hope you found it interesting. If you like the ideas, great. If you've got some, tweaks or changes, let me know. Otherwise, see ya.